Just for the sake of, please sit down. Thank you. Just for the sake of getting that, I don't think everybody heard you because you have the microphone. So although all of us here know the other folks with you at the table, if you could just reintroduce them for those who are in attendance.
Yes, we also have Director Elizabeth Tanner from the Department of Business Regulation and Matthew McCabe from the Office of Management and Budget.
Thank you and welcome. So please proceed.
Thank you very much. My name is Liz Tanner. I am the Director of the Department of Business Regulation. The Department of Business Regulation protects consumers and both licenses and regulates many professions and industries. We're here today to discuss Article 20, going to give a brief presentation and then we'll take questions. Does everyone have a copy of the presentation that's on the screen? Okay. Any information marked with an asterisk throughout the presentation reflects a change from the original article that is amended, so it's part of the sub-A that you should have received. Okay? Okay, you want to do that? Sure. Okay. Today, a Rhode Island adult can travel... Yes?
I'm sorry for interrupting. I apologize, but I want to make sure that we have a number of documents in front of us, and so you just identified a document you want to draw our attention to. Could you just tell us again? Is it this one right here?
Yeah, the colorful one with the map on the front.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, good to go. Okay. Today, a Rhode Island adult can travel 10 minutes over the state line into Uxbridge or 200 feet over the state line into Fall River and legally purchase marijuana in Massachusetts. As you can see on this chart, we can expect many more towns on our border to be selling marijuana soon. As more licenses in Massachusetts come online each week, including applications in Attleboro, Oxford, Wareham, Millville, Somerset, and 2 more locations in Fall River, marijuana is becoming even more available to Rhode Island residents. This means greater opportunities for overconsumption, impaired driving, underage use, and the many other ways that marijuana may negatively impact public health and public safety. This increased access to marijuana is sweeping the Northeast. Nearly every state north of Pennsylvania will either legalize or begin licensed sales of adult-use marijuana over the next year. But marijuana usage is not new in Rhode Island. For the past decade, Rhode Island has had one of the highest marijuana use rates in the country. These products are being used in our communities and will continue to be used within our borders as they become more available. The only question is, what can we do to make sure that they are as safe as possible, and how can we make sure that we have the resources to address the public health and public safety concerns that we are also concerned about. Article 20 will create the most restrictive and responsible adult-use marijuana framework in the country to ensure that Rhode Island has the proper resources to safeguard public health and safety. It will make sure that Rhode Islanders have access to the safest forms of these products locally and that we have the proper resources for public education and awareness, prevention, and law enforcement. In short, Article 20 will legalize, regulate, tax, and restrict access to adult-use marijuana by adults over the age of 21. Administratively, the article creates a new Office of Cannabis Regulation within DBR to coordinate the regulation of all cannabis products, including adult-use marijuana, medical marijuana, and industrial hemp and CBD products. It will distribute 25% of all tax revenue to the Departments of Revenue, Public Safety, Health, and the Office of Cannabis Regulation, and BHDDH to ensure the state has the proper resources to regulate the industry. Diving in a little deeper, for the revenue estimate, it assumes 1/3 of the possible sales in fiscal year 2020, full year in fiscal year 2021. Because of the partial year of sales in fiscal 2020, an additional share of adult-use marijuana revenues beyond 25% need to be allocated for startup costs. These startup costs equate to an additional 26% of revenue, for a total of 51% of revenue dedicated in fiscal year 2020. In fiscal year 2021 and going forward, the share for expenditures becomes 25%. As for expenditures, here you can see a breakdown of them totaling $7.44 million, including 17 new FTEs, full-time employees, to join existing DBR staff in the new Office of Cannabis Regulation. An additional 4 FTEs at Revenue to oversee tax collections, an additional 5 FTEs at the Department of Health for monitoring and educational awareness campaign, and 2 FTEs at BH-DDH for prevention and treatment, and dedicated revenue for state and local law enforcement to support their needs. Slide 5. Article 20 also ensures that 15% of tax revenue, a little over $2.1 million, will be distributed to cities and towns based on a formula that ensures every city and town receives funds even if they ban licenses locally. And then 60% of tax revenue, an estimated $6.5 million, will be deposited into the general fund in fiscal year 2020. The article also has very strong provisions for local control, allowing municipalities to ban licenses through a local ordinance, which must then be upheld by local referenda. After input from local officials, the timeline for a local referenda was pushed back from November of 2019 to November of 2020 to give municipalities more time and to ensure local referenda occur during regularly scheduled general elections. The article also permits municipalities to collect local impact fees to offset any local impact from new licensees. Under tax rate and structure, it uses a weight-based, on the right slide? Uses a weight-based cultivator excise tax combined with a special point of sale excise tax to ensure price stability and a floor for state collections.
Thank you, Director. Excuse me, Senator Archambault.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, would you just go back, please, to the dedicated expenditure and local share, as you talked about to the municipalities? Would you just go back over that in a little bit more depth and just amplify on the logic behind that and how this affects cities and towns, those that buy in and those that don't?
Absolutely, and thank you, Senator. So the proposed funding formula for sharing municipal revenue takes into account 3 different categories. First, you should know that 15% of all tax revenue that's collected from the sales would be dedicated to this municipal revenue sharing formula. With that 15% would then be separated into 3 categories. A quarter of that 15% would be distributed to every single city and town, regardless of whether they participate in the industry or not. We would be the first state to distribute funds to municipalities that do not allow these licenses. We do not think that cities and towns should be penalized just because they choose not to engage the industry. We understand that the externalities and the impacts of marijuana use will be felt by every single city and town, and they should have resources. So that's a quarter of that 15%. The other quarter of that 15% will be distributed to municipalities based off of the number and types of licenses that they have, with retail licenses being weighted higher than cultivation or manufacturing or testing licenses because of the additional impact that a retail facility can have on a local city or town. The last portion of this 15%, which is half of the revenue, would then be distributed based off of the volume of total sales. And this way, we are distributing funds, one to every single city and town, regardless of whether they opt to embrace or ban the industry or not. But then we're also making sure that towns that do move forward with the industry receive a proportionate amount of revenue based off of that to address any of the issues that may come up.
Senator Metz.
Yes. Well, I visited my sister in Michigan, and I saw this building, a few of them, in their neighborhood that had the green cross. So this is where they sold the marijuana. Now, all the people from the suburbs that didn't want these shops in their neighborhood, guess where they came to buy their marijuana? They came to the hood to buy their marijuana. So my concern, knowing that in my district, which has a lot of homelessness based on addiction and a lot of things like that, we don't want it in our neighborhood because we have enough problems. So for me, my concern, beyond the other thing, behind the finances, there may be some cities and towns, you say share it with everybody, even if they don't want it. But what happens to the neighborhoods where they may not have the same political clout as other areas, and then this is where all the shops are going to end up? How do we balance that out? Because what I see right now, when I go home and I ride by Crossroads and I go by the Amos house and I ride the 300 block on Broad Street to see who has the addiction and everything like that, I'm worried about the negative impact that it's going to have on my community, because you can't dump all these things in poor neighborhoods. So that's my concern. And if that's the case, if this is how it ends up, if that's the case, then it seems to me that the areas that are more negatively impacted should be getting some type of fund so that they can deal with the addiction. Because when they don't want someone in the suburbs, guess where they end up? They end up on that 300 block on Broad Street. So how is that going to be balanced out? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you,
Thank you, Senator Metz.
Thank you, Senator. So that is a very, very valid concern. It's something that other states, like Michigan, which was the latest state to pass adult use marijuana, is seeing, and it's a lesson that we've learned from other jurisdictions like Denver and Washington as well. This would put municipalities in control, so that if a municipality wants to, through their zoning and permitting authority, limit the number of retail establishments within their jurisdiction, they could do that. If they wanted to take an approach that's similar to what Boston did, which is to say, we will allow this, we understand that this is part of transitioning from the illicit market over to a regulated market, then we'll allow it, but they put in place buffers so that you have to have retail establishments certain distance from each other. So there are many different options for municipalities, including just a ban. A municipality would be able to ban these licenses if they wanted to. That could be done through ordinance for the first 16 months after this is passed, and thereafter would have to be upheld by a referenda, and at that point they would be able to look at the regulatory structure and see some of the impact from the jurisdictions that haven't banned and make an educated decision there. But if a municipality didn't want to go to a ban and they wanted to say, we're just going to have one of these and it's going to be zoned in this one district where we think it'll be do the least amount of harm, they'd be able to do that. For cities and towns that choose not to put in place either prohibitions and bans or restrictions through zoning and permitting, this would ensure that the cities and towns that do have the larger number of retail establishments or conduct the larger volume of sales also receive a larger amount of revenue to address any of the externalities and societal consequences of having these. And the last thing that I would point out is, the crux of this entire proposal is making sure that we have resources for public health and public safety, to make sure that we can do public health monitoring and surveillance, and the director is going to get to that in another slide or two. But there's a question that we need to ask ourselves is not doing this going to stop people from using now? We have one of the highest per capita use rates in the country we have for a decade. We're now going to have our residents able to go over the Massachusetts state line 200 feet or a 10-minute drive of what's open today, let alone the additional licensees that are going to be popping up in Attleboro and Millville and additional locations in Fall River. So there's a question of, are our citizens going to be just driving over the state line, buying this product and bringing it back without us having the resources to deal with this? And you're right about the problems that it can cause. So this puts us in a position to address that. And a lot of what you spoke to is, I think the director is going to cover in a couple more slides. So if it's okay, I'm going to hand it back over to her.
Finish up the slides there.
I'm sorry?
Can we finish up the slides first prior to the discussion or questions?
Sure, good, proceed.
Just final point on slide 5. I'll start from where I was. The tax rate and structure uses a weight-based cultivator excise tax combined with a special point of sale excise tax to ensure price stability and a floor for state collections. This will be nearly the same as Massachusetts, and what we're hearing is being proposed in Connecticut. Slide 6. This chart summarizes what is being proposed. Am I in the right spot? Okay. Adult use marijuana will be taxed using a combination of the sales tax, a retail excise tax, and a weight-based excise tax for a combined effective rate of about 20%. This tax structure will ensure competition with the region and help ensure stability for the market, licensees, and state revenue collections. Slide 7. Looking at public health, Article 20 includes public health and safety lessons learned from other states. And as a side note, as you can tell, we do spend a lot of time looking and speaking with the other states and learning from their best practices and mistakes that they have made. Under the article, the most potent and dangerous products, such as dabs, which contain upwards of 80 to 90% THC, will be banned and only available to patients in the medical program. The requirements for product form, potency, THC content, packaging, labeling, warnings, and advertising will be the safest and strictest in the country. No public use of marijuana will be permitted, nor will marijuana use be allowed in restaurants or other businesses. Smoking will be prohibited in any housing unit without the permission of the landlord. And the article uses best practices for public safety and includes training for state and local law enforcement, drug recognition experts, parentheses there's DRE. The article gives more legal weight to DRE testimony and allows the use of a chemical field test. There are also strong penalties for refusing to undergo a DRE evaluation, a chemical test, or violating open container laws similar to alcohol. There's also no home growing of marijuana, which will be allowed unless it's under the medical marijuana program. Slide 8. Looking at licensing, the article ensures a smooth transition to an adult use market, grandfathering in current medical marijuana licensees while making sure that medical marijuana supply and patient access are protected. The article also ensures market-based production caps to create a stable market and protect against the supply and pricing issues seen in other states. Under workplace use, the article does not compel an employer to tolerate marijuana use or impairment by an employee. This was something we heard often. Employers may adopt whatever marijuana use policy they feel is appropriate for their business. The article also allows employers to take disciplinary action against marijuana impairment in the workplace, as they are currently able to do with employees who are impaired by alcohol. Slide 9. Moving on to medical marijuana, the article continues the work of making regulated, safe medicine more accessible to patients by restructuring the Compassion Center license as a retail-only license and tripling the possibility of the number of center locations and doubling the number of center operators. This will increase geographical access to centers, expand distribution, and lead to greater variety of cultivator-produced products. This increased variety and access will promote competition and lower the price of medicine for patients. The article also continues to create more accountability in the medical program's home growing area. The article lowers plant counts by 1/2 and increases possession limits to narrow the discrepancy between what a patient can grow and what they can lawfully have in their possession. It also creates a demonstration of need and transfers all growing to caregivers for increased regulation and accountability. Slide 10. On the medical side, these changes, expanding access to regulated medical marijuana, will result in approximately $1.5 million in additional revenue. And finally, on page 11, with hemp, the article also expands licenses under the state's existing industrial hemp program. These changes bring the current program in line with recent changes in federal law and are needed to ensure that industrial hemp product distributors and retailers have federal and state protections to engage in this industry here and across the country. These changes also ensure that consumable hemp products are safe and subject to food safety regulations, and any hemp product that is vaporized or smoked is not sold to anyone underage. In closing, our current approach to marijuana has not been effective in stopping Rhode Islanders from using marijuana, and it will not stop what is happening around us and in neighboring states. The status quo will not stop people from driving a mere 200 feet to purchase it legally in Massachusetts, only to turn around and bring it and its consequences back to Rhode Island. What we can do is control the products that are accessible. We can make sure everything is in child-proof packaging. We can make sure that labels and advertising are not attractive to kids. We can prohibit the products which cause the most harm, and we can use this regulatory framework to fund the proper resources for police officers and public health officials. Thank you for your time. We are happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Director, for your presentation. Appreciate it very much. Senator McKinney.
How do our regulations match up with Massachusetts?
That's a great question. There are significant improvements in this framework to what Massachusetts has. If you look at Massachusetts, while the legislature did make amendments to their law and their structure, it was originally proposed as a ballot initiative, just like all the other adult use recreational or legal states. The problem with that process is that the ballot initiatives are typically written by the industry and by activists and then put to the voters. And as you can see, and as you've seen in past years, this is an extremely complicated regulatory issue with many, many intersecting and overlapping policies. And it's not as simple as binary, yes, it should be legal, no, it shouldn't be legal. So our proposal takes many steps that the Massachusetts proposal does not take as it regards to municipal revenue sharing and municipal authority, home growing, the variety of products which are going to be available or prohibited because of potency and dosage. We have taken the best practices and the best lessons learned from other states, including Massachusetts, Colorado, Washington, Alaska, Oregon, and we've seen what has worked well. We've also seen what they've needed to change, and that has informed this proposal.
Fine, thank you.
Senator Archambault.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. If we go back to it, these pages aren't numbered, but I want to go back to where it talks about protecting the public health. It says it's required to pass all laboratory testing. Could you amplify on laboratory testing? How do you define laboratory testing, and under what guidelines up against the current standards of the FDA? How do you define that? Can you just be very specific with me on that?
That's a great question, and the Director of the Department of Health will be up next, and then I do know that the Colonel of the State Police will be joining. He's doing some other testimony right now. Without getting into too much detail, because you will hear from her, the Department of Health has already promulgated regulations and begun the licensing process for analytical testing laboratories that are going to be in place for the medical marijuana program, and those licensees and those regulations would be used, if not added to as well, for adult use marijuana. That testing would involve randomized sampling of all product that's grown. It would be tested for cannabinoid profile, so people knew what the potency was and what's in it. It would be tested for microbial or fungal contamination, residual solvents, if it's being manufactured. We tested for heavy metal content. It would be tested for pesticide content as well. Really everything that the FDA would require if they weren't prohibited from taking action here would be covered by these regulations. We've looked at other states, we've spoken to other states, we've seen what their testing has been like, and we've learned from those lessons as well. It's a very, very comprehensive set of regulations that the Department of Health has done a wonderful job on, and we've been consulting with them as well. So we're very confident that this will mean that the products are as safe as possible, and surely much safer than products that are either grown in people's homes or that are currently sourced from the illicit market.
No, thank you, ma'am. Follow-up question, Chairman? Sure. With respect to protecting public safety, it talks about an automatic license suspension for anyone who refuses a chemical test, and just before that it says that anyone who's confirmed to have used marijuana would automatically be subject to that suspension. In the guidelines under the DUI law for intoxicating substances that are chemically related, not alcohol, there's a balancing between having drugs in your system and actual impairment. How do you regulate this aspect of it?
Yeah, so
You understand my question?
Absolutely.
It's a balancing of impairment with, is there a zero tolerance? And I ask you that, and not to compound the question, I ask you that because in light of medical marijuana, which is already accepted, that interest has to be just sort of juxtaposed with impairment as well. That makes sense?
Absolutely, and what the proposal seeks to do is, one, lean heavily on law enforcement drug recognition officers, because when you look at other states that have adopted per se laws that say, okay, we're going to use 5 milligrams of THC in blood content or a different per se threshold, one, because this is fat soluble and not water soluble, it impairs people differently under different amounts over different periods of time. And so you have situations where law enforcement says, because of my training and my experience, I know that, and what I observed, I know this person is impaired, but they happen to be under this arbitrary per se threshold. And that is not the approach that we want to take. We want to make sure that we have a law enforcement first approach that utilizes drug recognition experts. And the other thing we did is, because the technology is evolving very rapidly right now, there are chemical tests that are being piloted in Canada and in other jurisdictions which use oral fluid tests to detect either active levels of THC, and I say active, not metabolites that might be lingering for days, weeks, or months, but active THC in recent use. And so what this would do...
Chairman? Is that a field test?
It is a field test that's being piloted right now.
Would administer?
Yes. So the same process that we have in place right now in statute that authorize breathalyzers to be used in the field, which is the Department of Health approved that within the guidance of the statute, would allow the Department of Health to also approve a chemical test that utilized either oral fluid or anything else that could be administered in the field. We understand there's a gap here. We understand that the technology right now is about 80%. If you're a chronic user, you're going to get false positives. If you're ingesting it right now using a capsule or a pill that doesn't have THC on the outer coating, it won't get absorbed in the mucous membrane, and you're going to have a false negative. But the point here is to make progress, because the high use that we have now, the likelihood this will increase based off of Massachusetts and Connecticut and what's happening around us in the region, and to say as soon as this technology is at a place where it's no longer a pilot program in other jurisdictions and it meets a threshold that the Department of Health uses, we can implement it under state law the same way we implement a
You'll be able to
breathalyzer.
implement. Thank you, Chairman. May I have another follow-up question? Just a couple more, Lou.
No, go ahead,
and
go
I'll
ahead,
turn it
Senator.
over. So,
Follow up with whatever questions.
thank you,
need to ask.
Chairman.
Please.
With respect to the zero tolerance at work, if you will, and forgive me for taking some liberty with labeling it, I'm on a slide that talks about workplace use. It says all employers allows employers to discipline or terminate employees who test positive for marijuana use via active THC test. And I wrote to myself a question here: how do you differentiate recreational use from medicinal use in light of the HIPAA laws? You've got this wall of HIPAA laws that protect people medicinally. How do you balance that?
That's a great question. And so this is something we heard a lot from the different stakeholders that we engaged with, a lot of employers, the business community, the ACLU, patients on all sides. What was apparent to us is that the existing anti-discrimination language in the Medical Act is extraordinarily vague. It talks about a patient having protections because of their status as a card holder. It does not speak to use or impairment. It does not talk about different industries which maybe should be carved out from adhering to the protections that are in place because they're federal contractor, or they are subject to federal licenses, or they use firearms, or they operate a motor vehicle or an airplane or a boat. So what we have done is, through the sub-A that was filed, on the medical side, we've clarified this. We've said that when we're talking about these categories of employers, they are not subject to this protection and abiding by this because the public safety concerns are so large, and because of also intermingling federal guidance and law. On the adult use side, what we've done is we've made an amendment to go with the status quo in this state, which, we are an employer at will state. There is nothing, we don't want to unwittingly create a protected class for, marijuana or cannabis use where it doesn't exist for tobacco or alcohol or anything that an employer might choose to adopt. So what the amended language says is that an employer can adopt whatever policy they want to for their employees as it relates to marijuana use, provided that that employer is notified at the time that the policy is adopted or before hiring, and that it is uniformly applied to all members of the business. And you asked about testing as well.
Yes.
So what this does is it clarifies, similar to what we're looking down the road at with impaired driving, it clarifies that within the existing drug testing statute, which is extraordinarily limited, if someone tests positive for active THC, delta-9 THC, delta-8 THC through a drug test under the existing employment drug testing statute, that employers can take disciplinary action or fire those employees similar to how they would if someone were impaired by alcohol, because the impairment concerns with marijuana in the workplace are very, very similar to the impairment concerns with alcohol. And so while the existing statute for drug testing in the workplace talks about any narcotic, we want to maintain this prevention first stance and prevention first approach when it comes to opioids, and we're in the midst of that epidemic right now. But we understand that marijuana maybe shouldn't be looped in when you're talking about impairment on the scene, and we want to make sure that we have similar actions and availability and flexibility for our employers that we do.
If I can interject,
alcohol.
for what it's worth, I think it's smart that you're focusing on impairment as opposed to a zero tolerance of chemicals in the body, because if you go down that road, I think it's something you're going to find so amorphous, you're not going to be able to tie it into any regulatory scheme. It just, and I don't know how other states are dealing with it, but it's just an opinion. One final question, if I may, Chairman. What's the legal age? I didn't see that in the paperwork, and if I missed it, forgive me, but what's the legal age for the use of marijuana?
Yes, and it's on slide, I believe it's 2. So the legal age would be 21. This is the same as the legal age as in all other states that have moved forward with this. And then the possession limits would be 1 ounce of dry usable marijuana or an equivalent amount on your person, 5 ounces in your home.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Palmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, directors, and Matt, thank you very much for being here. So a couple specific and more the general. With regards to the allowing the local referenda, and some of us have been on councils and we're all familiar with local referenda, we do other things by ordinance. Why not allow cities and towns to do things by ordinances as opposed to putting it out there to local referenda? So I asked the question, why was that the case? And I know in the original language you had a combination of the original referenda that had to be on the ballot this year, and the amendment moved it out to next year, or you passed a local ordinance which has to be read twice and all those kinds of things. Can you talk to me about the rationale of why not an ordinance, and would you be willing to do that as opposed to a referenda? Bless you.
Thank you, Senator. So the thought here was looking at other structures that have been put in place in other states, including Massachusetts, and in which the citizens had an opportunity to vote on this statewide. A ballot referendum is not something that is within the Rhode Island Constitution in terms of something that's voter initiated. It's also it is also we felt that the structure we had in place was flexible enough, especially with the amendments, to 16 months of a ban, and then allowing the citizens and the residents of a municipality to weigh in, particularly so that people could be heard who are on border communities that are right on the other line of Massachusetts, and they're seeing the impact, or they're seeing people go over the line and functionally subsidize public health and public safety programs in Massachusetts, where Rhode Island is left with the consequences. I think in terms of we would be open to purely an ordinance-based mechanism for municipal authority. If it means getting in place these regulatory structures so we can address the public health and public safety means, we want to work with all stakeholders, and we would want to make sure that this proposal can move forward. We understand that this is the first hearing on this. While we've engaged tremendously with a lot of stakeholders and we've made a lot of changes, we understand there are more concerns and more changes that might have to be fleshed out, and we wouldn't want to, I think, tie ourselves to anything too strongly that would prohibit the overall goal of making sure that we have resources for public health and public safety.
So with regards to the municipal side of things and the revenue sharing, I'll say revenue sharing plus, right? Everybody benefits, and then if you allow it in your community, you benefit more. So let me start off by saying from the get-go, because my questions you'll know where I'm coming from as opposed to guessing where I'm coming from.
Sure.
So I don't support the article at all. I just don't, from a policy perspective. Regardless of what happens in Mass and Connecticut, it's either the right policy or it isn't. The money is secondary. It's policy first, fiscal second. That's our budget, right? We do policy first and the fiscal piece second. Is the revenue sharing with regards to every city and town really just a means to ensure that we have 113 legislators, that the majority of the legislators are going to want to support this because we're giving revenue to every city and town? Can you talk to how we decided that, how that came about, in all honesty?
Yeah, absolutely not. Revenue sharing for municipalities has been used in every single jurisdiction as or other state as a carrot to get people to buy in.
I understand. Yep.
And we're saying we are a small state that's densely populated, surrounded by small states that are densely populated. We're going to be impacted and affected by this no matter what. Everyone should receive some revenue from the industry here. This isn't support this because there's some revenue on the table for you. This is, we understand that you're going to be impacted one way or another. And just because you say you don't want this in your town doesn't mean you're not going to have people traveling from one municipality to another or from one state that has it, back to your hometown. We want to put resources in the hands of our state agencies and our municipalities to be able to deal with this. You say policy before revenue. The policy here is to be able to have resources for public health and public safety that don't exist today, that haven't existed historically, and which have been needed and are going to continue to be needed, especially as this substance becomes more available. The other policy concern is to make sure that, we have high use rates right now. That is mostly product that comes from the illicit market that could have mold, mildew, pesticides, heavy metal contaminant that's, aiding in helping to sustain an illicit market. Let's shift that because the behavior hasn't changed under prohibition. Let's put that towards products that are safer and to fund different public awareness campaigns and different regulatory and public health and safety programs that can maybe do some good and address these concerns.
If I may follow, Sue?
Sure.
So, Director, I agree with everything you said and to the end. And if we were doing this to affect public benefit, we would do everything to say that we were never going to have this. The public education would be such that, like we've done with nicotine and cigarettes, articulate the reasons why you should not have this. The THC in this, and there's THC in it, there's nothing good about THC in the body, that I've read anyway. Maybe there is, I've not read it. I'm not saying anything. Also, I've not seen anything with regards to this not being the gateway to the next drug that's out there. So we can say it's going to be better, it's going to be cleaner. The black market, underground market's not going away. Those folks that are out there doing it will continue to do it. Can we go to the edibles for a second, if we may? So I read an article, I was trying to bring it up here again now. It was in The Hill, article, federal legislator, online magazine, talking about the company Jelly Beans, and the gentleman who created Jelly Beans. And I'm not going to pronounce the word correctly, but it's cannabidiol?
Cannabidiol. Cannabidiol?
Cannabidiol.
CBD?
I know CBD, but
Yeah.
Cannabidiol.
Yes.
So the fear with that is a set of adults, and people say, well, adults can leave things around. But we all have kids, mom's kids, some have grandchildren. See those jelly beans, not going to differ to those jelly beans from any other jelly beans, and maybe it's going to be a different color or texture, but how are we addressing edibles in this with regards to that particular issue? Because if we think and I'll be questioning for Director Nicole Alexander Scott when she comes up, if that's not a public health issue, I don't know what is.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a huge concern with these products because they can take the shape and form of other products that aren't infused. So Colorado went through a bit of a rocky period with this. Their original regulations for edibles did not require each individual serving to be clearly marked. There wasn't clear demarcation. There was not separate packaging for each serving. There was not a universal symbol on the actual product itself. And as a result, they saw a lot of accidental ingestion, particularly by youth. And they also saw people over-consuming because they weren't sure what a serving size was. Since that rollout, they have made tremendous progress, and it's been reflected both in their poison control call numbers since that initial rollout, and also in the emergency room and hospitalization rates, because they now have a program where every single serving has a mark on it. It's either embedded into the gummy or it's embedded into the chocolate, and it is a symbol that says, this is marijuana. This has THC. So even if it's removed from the outer packaging, even if it's left around, people will know and people won't accidentally take it. The other thing they do is very strong packaging requirements so that everything that is in a child-resistant, tamper-evident package, it's the same standard and the same process that is used by pharmaceutical companies for prescription drugs. Anything that is a multi-use or multi-servings has to be resealable and use that exact same, have that same process. So we've come a long way here. We've learned from other states, and they didn't necessarily know to make sure that these products were identifiable and recognizable as containing THC or marijuana, even if they're removed from the packaging. They didn't know to say, okay, if it's multi-use and there are multiple doses in there, make sure it's child-resistant, not the first time you open it, but every subsequent time, so it's resealable, or the use of exit bags. So that's how that's been able to be pretty effectively addressed in other states, and that's where we would be starting from.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just summarize.
Please, please go ahead.
So this is really more of a comment and a question. So Norm, you've been in front of us for, I don't know how many years now. It seems like it's a lot. It probably is a lot. And as long as we're sitting on the Finance Committee, we hear something with regards to the medical program every year. We're going to make it better. Our goal is to make it better. Our goal is to improve it. Our goal is to do something, another dimension or adjective to the medical program. And now we're adding the recreational program with it as well. Said this last year, said it the year before, and the year before that. And don't take this, and you may take it in a negative way, but it's not meant to take it in a negative way. We still don't have a strategic plan, I'll call it a strategic plan, on the medical program, or now the new recreational program we want to have in the state of Rhode Island. If you think back to what we've done every single year, there's been a new dimension. We're going to have more compassion centers. If you're a compassion center, you can't be a cultivator, you can't be a distributor or manufacturer. If the existing ones, they could be all three. This year, I knew we're changing some of the names. You could be a couple different things. We're learning from Colorado. We're learning from Massachusetts. We're learning from others. We're learning from them on the edibles. We're learning from them on other things. And I say this because I will kick the can down the road. Like I said, I don't support the recreational use. Medicinal, yes, if it's in the right shape or form. But we really don't have a strategic plan or a program plan. I will call it a strategic plan on medicinal, and now we want to add the recreational side of things. So when we look at it and we say, well, we're here now, we're much more informed. I don't disagree, we're much more informed. But do we have a plan about why we're doing what we're doing? Because last year, if we look at what we're doing now compared to what was proposed last year, it's different. And it's different than the year before that. And every year we believe we have the right plan. So how should I look at it? How should we look at that? Or how should the public look at that and say, you were going to do this last year or the next year or the year prior? What do we say?
Yeah, I would say that this is a comprehensive plan. What we have proposed in past years has also been a comprehensive plan. We have made tremendous progress since the last time we had amendments to this program back in the FY16 budget. Since then, we have gone from over 3,600 caregiver registrations down to less than 1,000. When we started our plant tagging program to register grows and track plants in the home grows, we had over 70,000 plant tags that were ordered. Now we have less than 28,000 plant tags. The strategic plan here is to make sure that for the medical program, these products that people need to address their medical conditions are as safe as possible, accessible as possible, in stable supply, and offered in a way and through a regulatory structure where it does not cause harm to people who aren't in the program and doesn't leak out to people who aren't in the program. The plan and the vision for the adult use side is to say, we have had this approach that has not worked historically, which is likely to get worse. We know from other states different programs that have been effective when it comes to public education, public awareness, and the different things that they've had to put in place and change in order to make sure that these products are available and as safe as possible and causing the least amount of harm. We can't give you a strict statutory structure right now that's going to say, and this is going to do it for the next 20 years. What we can do is say, here's a licensing and a statutory structure, which employs everything we've learned so far and gives us the ability to be flexible to address these concerns as they move forward as we get additional data. And we think that that is better than the status quo, which is almost 30% of Rhode Islanders as monthly users, and which is likely to see large amounts of Rhode Island adults traveling to Massachusetts to subsidize their public health and public safety programs, bringing these products back, using them here, and negatively impacting our communities without the resources to address it. This is a constantly innovative industry. It changes every 6 to 8 months with new products and new things at the federal level and what's happening around us with our neighbors. If we wait and wait and wait until we have something that is perfect, we're going to completely miss it, and we're going to have a very large hole to dig ourselves out of. We should not let the perfect be the enemy of the good here. And what we're proposing would be the most regulated and restrictive and public health and public safety forward regulatory structure and proposal in the country.
Norm, Director and Matt, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Senator Sosnowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. I wanted to talk about industrial hemp. As you know, maybe a lot of other people don't know that Rhode Island already has hemp, a process for growing hemp on the statute already. So my questions are, I have several. Looking at the bill, it's the licensure fee is going to be $2,500 to grow hemp, industrial hemp. And as you have said in your slide, industrial hemp is now a federally legal product. It was passed in the Farm Bill, as we all know. And on your slide, you mentioned that there'll be a new regulatory structure to update the statute to align with changes in the Federal Farm Act and provide federal protections to industry operators. Just looking at the bill, I'm not sure what type of federal protections for growers are in the bill. When I'm looking at the legislation, and it seems quite comprehensive if you are growing a federally legal product now. You still have to have a background check. Everything is still here that was in the current statute when hemp was not legal. And then we're increasing the licensure to $2,500 every 2 years, along with an application fee of $250. So I have already heard from people in the agricultural community that feel that $2,500 is too much for a federally legal crop. And Massachusetts, I believe, is they're charging application fee of $100 and $300 for a license fee. So that's quite from going from $300 to $2,500. That's a big difference. So I guess my questions are, what are the federal protections that are in the legislation? And is the statute reflective of the federal law or a federal rule? And if hemp is being grown for other products other than edibles, for instance, rope and paint and all that kind of stuff, shouldn't they have different regulations than an edible? And I guess I got a lot of questions, but are any other states charging $2,500 for a licensing fee to grow a federally legal crop? And I just want to remind everyone that marijuana, cannabis for recreational use is still federally illegal, where hemp is not. So I think there's a lot of confusion here about hemp and cannabis for recreational use. So.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you. This is often an overlooked part of the cannabis market and industry, and it's one of the fastest growing ones, and we're seeing a lot of movement here federally. Let me first speak to the federal protections. The federal protections that exist are not stemmed from our state statute. They stem from the Federal Farm Act and the recent changes that were made and the amendments that were made at the end of 2018. What that change says is that this is a descheduled substance, and it will be federally legal provided the state adopts a regulatory framework and licensing, and a new requirement is that the state takes that regulatory framework and sends it to the Secretary of the Department of Agriculture, and they approve it. So what our original hemp bill did was it created a license for growing and for handling, and the definition of handling at that point was basically the extraction of or manipulation of the plant. What it did not provide for was a license to use that as an ingredient in something that might be consumed. It also did not provide for a license to engage in the distribution or the retail sale. We've had many licensees say, we would like this license, we want to be able to say to people, we're complying with state law, this is something we can do, and we just didn't have the authority because those licenses weren't in the original bill. So understanding that everything needs to be in this bill and then the subsequent regulations need to be approved by the federal government in order to receive the federal protections, we've said let's add these license categories so that we're clarifying that there is a license for these activities. They are legal under state law. We can send that to the Federal Department of Agriculture for approval, and then those federal protections will extend. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg, because you have federal protections if there's a state regulatory structure, and then that state regulatory structure then needs to be approved. So we're really filling the gaps here, and this has been prompted by a lot of feedback from the industry that we've heard, because they would like to see this. As for the licensing fee, this is not something we have changed. This is not new language. This is not an increase. This was the fee that was part of the original statute that was passed, I believe, in the 2016 or 17 session. So we did not increase the fee here. Recognizing that there is a large fee for these manufacturers, what we did do is we said for the new fees the new licenses that we're creating, the distributor license and the retail license, those licenses will be free for anyone who holds these other handler or grower licenses, because that is such a large fee already. I think talking about cutting that fee would be a different conversation, one that the administration is open to having, but we did not increase this fee. This is status quo. This is what's been in place. So I hope that addresses your main comments. As for the regulations and how things are treated differently, whether it's a consumable product or rope in an industrial product, this section of Article 20 specifically addresses those concerns. It says anything that is a industrial hemp-derived CBD consumable product is now defined as such. It's being consumed. It's not hemp. It's not a textile. And that is going to fall under food safety standards and food code that the Office of Food Protection under the Department of Health administers. And these products are also going to be subject to packaging and labeling restrictions to make sure that people are aware that this contains cannabis. While they don't control THC, which is the psychoactive ingredient, people should still be aware, because while CBD, it does not pose the same risks or harms, we still don't have the type of research we would like from the federal government on this in the FDA, and we're hopeful that this recent federal movement will result in more research and better guidance. So this creates the structures, I think, to provide the federal protections to allow the industry to take root and to allow them to take root in a way that's regulated. Because under existing law, with the definition of OTP products and cigarettes, a vapable or smokable hemp or CBD product doesn't fall under our existing definitions. There's nothing that says you couldn't sell that to a 12-year-old. So we want to make sure that we have these regulatory structures in place to safeguard public health and safety, that the Department of Environmental Management is involved, that the Department of Health is involved, and that we can have the right rules and regulations for things that are consumable products. They wouldn't be treated the same as, say, an industrial fiber or hemp.
Right. Okay. If I may, Mr. Chairman, can I? So I realize that the $2,500 is in the statute now, but this was when it was really, it wasn't a federally legal crop at the time when that was written. And are you aware of other than, we know Massachusetts is charging right now, and Connecticut hasn't, I don't think they've gone that far in working on industrial hemp yet, but other states with a $2,500 fee, are you aware of any other?
I'm not.
Okay.
I think our statute has some structures that other states don't have, including seed-to-sale requirements that other states don't have. So we're...
Okay. I guess I'll do a little more research on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Mr.
Senator.
Chairman.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to follow up on what I was asking you earlier, and I'll just share with you, my community is tired of being the dumping ground. And what happens is we've had methadone clinics put in our neighborhood that no one knew nothing about. And there's something similar to methadone that's less regulated, that doesn't have the same regulations. And the reason why I mentioned that, we don't want to be the dumping ground, because most of the people, a lot of the people that use that stuff aren't from, that use these facilities aren't from our community. And so that's a big concern. So when you were talking about earlier in the presentation about the revenue sharing, how have other states factored in the impact on economically challenged areas or high crime areas? Have other states factored that in to their revenue sharing plan? And if they haven't, I certainly think that something needs to be factored into this plan. But I want to know, have other states factored that in, the impact on economically challenged areas or high crime areas?
So other states, and thank you for the question, Senator, other states typically look at different areas that have been disproportionately impacted by prohibition and the war on drugs when it comes to licensing and access to the industry. They do not, as far as I am aware, and we've done a lot of research on this, factor that into revenue distribution. There's an argument that some of the revenue from this industry, instead of going to specific license applicants or people trying to take advantage of this industry, should be used for small business loans generally to help those communities so that they're not just pigeonholed into getting some type of economic benefit that comes from the cannabis industry. And I think that's a conversation we look forward to having. It can be very challenging based off of the experience other states have had with some of their programs that take into account areas that have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. But to answer your question, no. Other states have not done this when it comes to revenue sharing with cities and towns. They have simply just done it as a licensing priority for certain applicants.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Medical marijuana, we've had that maybe about 11 years now, and it seems like every year we're trying to establish guidelines to get it right, so to speak. And I noticed in your presentation you mentioned that there'd be a new Office of Cannabis Regulation, and within DBR that would oversee 3 different silos, or whatever you want to call them. One would be the adult use marijuana market, the second would be the industrial hemp regulations, and then the oversight of the existing medical marijuana program. Are those 3 distinct silos, or can one be within 2 different silos, so to speak?
Those would be 3 separate categories or silos, as you say, with separate licenses and separate regulations, although the medical regulations and the adult use regulations, when appropriate, would probably look similar in certain areas as it's appropriate. But those would be separate and distinct licenses.
In other words, for instance, I'm a cultivator, and right now all I have is 3 different compassion centers to distribute from the medical perspective. I'm limited then because I'm not allowed to become a part of the recreational aspect, or do I have to get a separate license for that part of it?
So you would be subject to a separate license, but what the proposal does is it says that if you are currently licensed on the within the medical program, as long as you are still in good standing with the Department of Business Regulation or the new Department of Office of Cannabis Regulation, and you satisfy any new regulatory requirements, you get access to that license automatically. So there are structures where people would hold dual licenses and they could co-locate them. There are some regulations that we would continue to have separate for medical marijuana manufacturing and products, especially those that are of higher potency and higher dose that we don't want available on the adult use side. But this creates distinct and intertwined licensing similar to what other states have seen being successful. It gives the existing licensees access under the same activities that they do now. It also puts in place a structure so we can make sure that access to that adult use industry doesn't jeopardize patient medicine and supply for patients.
Because one of the inequities that I thought existed is that we have probably 2,000 growers, I would assume, on the patient caregivers aspect that allows them to grow a certain number of plants for certain card holders. And we probably have, at the time last year when we had the discussion, it was maybe 19,000 card holders. And one of the inequities that I saw was the fact that we were expanding the cultivators, and it seemed like from 23 to potentially another 100 applications coming in for the cultivators, but they only had 3 compassion centers to distribute it to. So it seemed like there was an unfair pricing going on where it was not convenient for the person that wanted that medical marijuana to go to that specific compassion center because we only had them in Warwick, Providence, and Portsmouth or something to that effect. Do we look at expanding it in this legislation?
We do, and so I'm glad you brought up the cultivators, Senator. We had an initial application period about 2 years ago where we accepted cultivator applications, and that application period closed. We have not renewed it since. So every cultivator that currently is either licensed or approved came through that initial application period because we have this discrepancy between the supply and the distribution to patients. As was proposed by the governor last year and requested an amendment the year before, this proposal, Article 20, would expand distribution and access to medical marijuana. It would go from 3 compassion center operators to 6 operators. It would go from 3 locations to 9 locations. It would also restructure the license so that any compassion center now is only able to engage in retail sales for any of those 6 new locations. So that means that we're expanding the shelf space and the number of people that the cultivators can sell to, and that new distribution will only be available to those cultivators because we're not saying that the new compassion centers will be able to grow and manufacture as the old ones did.
Just one more quick question. How many cultivators do we currently have? Do we have any means or any? We have an obligation, obviously, to the compassion centers, but are we going to limit our number of cultivators? And how many do we have?
So we have functionally limited the number of cultivators by not reopening that application period. Everyone got their application within the deadline, so if they wanted to move forward, even with the market lopsided and imbalanced without having adequate distribution right now, they're free to do that, and that's a business decision that they are making. Currently, we have 41 licensed cultivators and another 33 that have been approved. So far this year, 29 of those cultivators have conducted a wholesale to a compassion center. That's since the beginning of the calendar year, so the last 2.5 months or so, selling approximately 1,500 pounds of marijuana since the beginning of the calendar year.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for your time. I see in one of the slides here under protecting public health that this staff and funding are going to be provided to DOH and DDH for public health surveillance, data collection, prevention, and product safety. Regarding data collection, is there an ongoing data collection in place now? Are you doing a baseline study so that we can see what the impact is if marijuana is legalized and is up and running? We want to know what the impact is when it comes to DUIs, visits to the hospitals.
That is an excellent question. I know that representatives from the Department of Health plan on coming to answer questions in the next group. I will say that they have made changes within the last couple of years of adding additional public health survey questions that have to do specifically with marijuana and marijuana use to be able to have legacy data to track this through the YRBS public health poll and the Burfus poll. They also have done some internal work to look at hospital admissions and poison control calls and all the things that other states have had to look back on a little too late to try to establish baseline data. So I'll let the Department of Health, when they're up here, speak to that a little bit more if you have more questions. But that is absolutely something that has been on our radar for the last 2 years that the Department of Health has been engaged in.
Thank you.
So I just got a couple of questions. The first one is, it's not really clear from what you presented what benefit is going to accrue to our prevention programs, which are meager in the state. We've got a very robust structure and resources that are out there, but they're not really funded. PHTDH does what they can, but prevention money going to the prevention coalitions, and there's one for each county or each region, and they're all under contract. So it's a good structure. It's a good avenue to get resources out here to help prevention, especially for our school children. But there's no money. The money that the state uses for prevention is pretty much divvied up from the federal monies that come through. We've been trying for a while to fix that without much luck. What I'm seeing here in your presentation doesn't look all that helpful. I'm concerned, not only are we under-resourcing prevention and messaging to our kids, but we're also now messaging that everything we told you is, you need to believe us, but we're still going to legalize marijuana. So there's a mixed message, it's inconsistent, and it seems to me that the prudent thing to do would be add some significant resources to the education and messaging to our K through 12 population in a much more effective way than we currently do it, which basically, is almost non-existent. The prevention coalitions are they're hanging by a thread. They want to keep a professional cadre in place to manage these, and it's hard to keep people because you can't really pay them for the level of qualification they bring to the table. So what are you guys going to do about this? Because I'm seeing 2 FTEs and additional funding for prevention and treatment. And we all know, that the biggest demand signal comes from the treatment side, because those are people who are hurting, they're already ill, and you got to try to find a way to fix them. And that's hard, and it's very expensive, and we're not doing a whole lot to keep people from traveling down that path in the first place. And the source of frustration I have with that circumstance, I can't express. So I would like to see something more. For the money that's coming in, I would like to see some local state resources go into the prevention programs. You have a place to put the money. They're effective and they're ready to work. They just don't have any money. So how is all this going to fix that?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I'm going to let Matt McCabe from OMB talk a little bit about the funding structure here, and also how it might work with local grants to get it into the hands of the people who are on the ground. One thing I do want to mention is that you're absolutely right about the need for resources here, and it's not something that we've seen from other states that you can just throw money at, because we have seen other states with very, very effective prevention campaigns and very ineffective and expensive prevention campaigns. So this really goes hand in hand with the work that the Department of Health will be doing through public health monitoring, surveillance, and also public education awareness campaigns that they'll be doing, and working in tandem and in concert with Buddha. And the other thing is, this good information is very important. In other states, they were looking at accidental ingestions and poison control calls, and they realized, why are we having so many from Hispanic-speaking households? And they realized, before they had better increased regulations and structures around edibles, that you had the hospitality industry going into hotel rooms, getting these edible products before they were individually wrapped and scored with warning, not realizing they were edible, bringing them home, and their kids were getting to them. And so understanding how to target these resources is maybe not just as important as the sheer amount of revenue, but is certainly important. It's something we've given a lot of thought to make sure that the two departments can work in concert. And I'm going to let Matt talk a little bit about the projection, how the revenue is projected to be used.
Thank you, Norm. Thank you, Senator. Just put some numbers to some of our topics here. So at BHDDH, we anticipate 2 FTEs, as you mentioned, 1 FTE focused on prevention, 1 FTE focused on recovery. And we anticipate around, so that's basically half of your, so I guess I should back up for a second. Total funding at BHDDH is $500,000 in the proposed budget. Half of that is for those 2 FTEs. The last half of that is for prevention and recovery services and grants. So we we anticipate $100,000 going to substance use disorder programs, and then another $90,000 going to prevention and media campaigns.
So let me ask you, I mean, BHDDH already has people that are administering the program that exists with the prevention coalitions and the student assistance counselors that are in the schools and all that. 2 more FTEs, I mean, in my mind's eye, you're going to hire somebody basically to call up the people who are really doing the work and ask them how it's going. And the answer coming back is, well, not that well, you're not giving me any money. So that leaves me cold. And then the leftover money's, $100,000 for each, between prevention and treatment.
If they hear,
Well, that's great, but I think we're spending something like $15 million just giving rides to people back and forth for methadone treatments. Why can't we use this as an opportunity to really up our game in terms of educating our children?
That's a fair point.
We're telling them that it's okay for their parents to go do this stuff. Okay?
So one point I will make,
Since I was a kid, but there's a message there that I'm getting, and it's not what you're saying it is. So what I'd like to see is more resources from whatever money we're going to get from this program, going towards trying to educate our kids not to do it, even though that we sort of going down this path with an inconsistent behavior.
2 points I'll make, and I'll turn it back to Norm for his comments. Because we are dedicating a quarter of all revenue from this, a quarter of all sales tax, fees, excise taxes, this share of revenue going to substance use and prevention will grow over time, right? So having those 2 people in place is important, but obviously, the share of money devoted to grants and these other programs will grow as the market grows. Secondly, I'll say that health also has some money dedicated to prevention and communication. So one of their 2 FTEs proposed is dedicated to communications, and I think they also have another $200,000 dedicated to those efforts. So it's not just BHDDH, it's also health, and also I'll let health talk more about that when they come up here. And Norm,
we pride ourselves in putting forth a proposal that, when compared to the rest of the country, is one of the most restrictive and aggressive, both on the regulatory and public health and safety side. If there are things we can do and work with the legislature and additional stakeholders to make that even better, I think we want to do that, and we want to have those conversations to figure out a way to do that. One thing I will say, and we were recently on a call with a woman who is contracted with both the National Institute of Drug Abuse and also the CDC Foundation, doing public monitoring and prevention work around cannabis and adult use states. Her background was from smoking cessation and tobacco. And she said, you cannot just take the revenue and put it into your existing drug treatment and education programs. People who want to treat the education component for youth like you're treating it with tobacco or alcohol, it's not going to be effective. There are different things here. And then also pointing to different statistics that show that actually this is the healthiest generation of children when it comes to binge drinking and tobacco products. But then when you look at vaping, you're seeing large increases, and with marijuana, you're seeing kind of stable use as opposed to the declines we're seeing with tobacco and alcohol. And what that shows her, and this is someone we hope to work with further to get her expertise as she's monitoring what's happening in other states and at the federal level, is that making sure we use these funds in a strategic way, and we're not just throwing everything behind existing programs, because this is slightly different. So I think we look forward to working with stakeholders in the legislature to see if there are things we can do to bolster the resources, and then also making sure we're tapping into the experts both internally that we have at the local level and experts at this in other states and at the federal level to make sure that this money is being used in the best way possible.
So I think what you just told me, if I understood you, is that the current program that we have with the prevention coalitions fanned out across the state is not working, and we shouldn't do that. We should do something different.
I wouldn't say that it's not working, but I would say that we still have one of the highest marijuana use rates in the country, and we have for the last decade. So I think we need to do a bit of a dive, given what the federal, what federal public health officials are doing in concert with Buddha and our existing Department of Health to make sure that we're using these resources in a way that has proven to be effective in the past, but maybe even more effective moving to the future. I'll let representatives from the Department of Health or Buddha speak to the effectiveness of what's happening now, but the conversations that we've had with people is to say that you need a multifaceted approach here, and tobacco cessation and tobacco education is not the same as marijuana education. The Truth campaign around nicotine use and tobacco use has been one of the most successful public health awareness campaigns in the history of this country when it comes to that substance and youth use, yet the large drops we're seeing in tobacco use, we're seeing a stabilization or a slight decrease in marijuana. It's not the same. So they're just things that we have to be open to making sure we're allocating these resources as efficiently as possible.
Okay, well, I understood some of that, but here's my message back to you. Put some more money into the prevention programs. You can't really judge them because you've never really funded them. Okay, and I'll say the same thing when Booty gets up here. And they know better than me what they're up against trying to keep these things going because we're not investing in them. So you want to judge them, that's fine, but invest in them first and let them fail, adequately resourced before you judge them. So my second question is, can Massachusetts sell marijuana to anybody?
Anyone within their jurisdiction right now.
I don't know what that means. If I go over there to buy some, will they sell it to me?
Absolutely. If you're within the state lines, if you're within the state of Massachusetts and you're over the age of 21 and you're at a licensed retail, you can
So
buy.
I don't have to have a Massachusetts ID or a Rhode Island license, they can sell it to me?
Correct.
Okay. I'm done. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Any other questions from committee members? Senator Palmer.
So, Norm, just to follow up, and Director Tanner as well. So we're going to bring on 17 plus 5 plus 2 plus 4. That's 28 new FTEs within state government we're going to bring on for this program. This, both medicinal and the recreational piece. Mm-hmm. What can we say about additional FTEs needed in the future?
I think that is going to depend on the size of the industry, but what we have done is take into account the industry growth and participants and volume of both sales and production that we've seen from now stable markets in other states. You have Colorado and Washington, where in one, 80% of all of their marijuana consumption is coming from licensed facilities there, and the other is, I think, past 90 at this point. And so we looked at that. We looked at the per capita usage. We looked at the amount of licensees that we thought that we would need here, and these FTEs, based off of our analysis and what we've seen from other states, should be sufficient to be able to have a very good regulatory hold over the industry. That it will continue to evolve and potentially change, but based on the best available data that we have and what we're seeing elsewhere, we're confident that this will meet our needs.
So likely the number will go up. Since we don't really, I beg to differ with you earlier with regards to, we don't have a comprehensive plan. We continue to change it and evolve, but this is 28 people. And if every person, FTE is about $100,000, I know it's more than that. We're talking about $2.8, $3 million we're adding to the budget annually for this program, and it's only going to rise. It's not going to go down necessarily. Going back though to the point where, and it's really not a question for Director Alexander Scott. This is my last question. We talk about, I'm going to try and put in my words as I'm hearing what's been said. Put the policy aside for a second, because it needs to be a policy decision first. We need to do this because Rhode Island will be impacted by the negative public health impacts. That's a bad word. We will incur negative public health impacts because of Rhode Islanders going to Massachusetts or Connecticut to purchase the products. We need to benefit in those purchases in Rhode Island so that we can address the public health benefit. That's what I'm hearing. Am I hearing that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Given that, we should do everything in our power so that all 1 million people in the state of Rhode Island, or just excess of 1 million people, back on the line of Senator 70, who's been an advocate and champion in trying to address the education side of things, to do everything in our power to convince, I'll be facetious, all 1,050,000 people to never, ever, never, ever, ever have cannabis with THC because it's a negative health benefit. We're doing it because if you go across the line, Rhode Island will incur the negative health benefit from that. So if it has a negative health benefit, and we do it with cigarettes and other things to get the taxes from it, we get a lot of money in taxes if you look at those dollars that come in from that. If the Lung Association was sitting there, or the American Heart Association was sitting there, they would say that if we can have smoking cessation for everybody, we would be a healthier Rhode Islander, healthy Rhode Island. Our overall costs for health insurance would go down, productivity would go up, et cetera, et cetera. So I'd leave you with the point of everything in our power to ensure that every single Rhode Islander never ever wanted to have the product would be in our best interest, because the negative health benefit would be gone. We'd have healthier people, meaning our costs for everybody would go down because insurance goes down, productivity, all those kinds of things. Families, et cetera. The negative impact of also follow-on drugs, and because of the THC and the proclivity to take the next step, wouldn't be there either. I'm not asking you to comment. You can if you like, but I just think that's the case of, we talk about a public health benefit. It's policy first, fiscal second, but we're just choosing to say we're going to make some more money off of this to address the public health benefit.
I'll comment briefly. 90% of people don't develop any type of use disorder or issue with cannabis use. There are many people, some of whom I'm sure you'll hear from today because of the topic of medical marijuana, that say that this has a lot of public health benefits for people. Because of the federal prohibition on the product and the research, it's lacking here from this country. They're making a lot of progress both in Canada, because it's federally legal there, and in Israel and in other places, Netherlands, about the potential health benefits of cannabis and cannabis use, specifically around, CBD, but also THC, because THC and CBD work in concert together. The issue that we have, I don't think, is cannabis use generally or marijuana use generally in all circumstances is something that is terrible or bad, and the data hasn't reflected that. But what the data has shown is that for certain, it's an 80-20 substance. 20% of the users use 80% of the substance. That's not good. The other thing it says that we've seen is failure to take action and control this through a regulated means does not stop use for people. We have very high rates. We continue to have high rates. It hasn't stopped use in other states as well. So if the choice is between legalizing or not legalizing, and if not legalizing meant that no one was going to obtain it through the illicit market or through Massachusetts or through any other means whatsoever, and we're never going to have to put in place this regulatory framework to make sure that for the 90% of people who won't develop an issue, it's as safe as possible and they're not ingesting mold or mildew or pesticides, and we didn't have to then put in place other regulatory structures for these high potency, high dose products, which, can be bad for the 10% of people who could develop something, then I think that's a conversation. But I think we have to take into account our surroundings and our history and how available this substance is and how dangerous it can be, and not just for the 10% of people who can have some issue, but for the person who's never going to develop a substance use disorder, the person who's going to use responsibly, who's never going to get behind the wheel, but who's going to take a product which is covered with myclobutanol, which if it's sprayed on your grapes and you drink wine is fine, but the second it's combusted turns into cyanide gas, right? So there's strong consumer protection frameworks in here for the people for whom this isn't a public health or public safety issue if they choose to use, and many of them, substantial amount of them are. So that's what I would say in response, and it's a fluid issue.
Thank you, Senator. Just in maybe some closing questions or observations, this is probably kind of beside the point, but you noted in your introductory statements that we're a densely populated state. I'm worried that we might not be densely populated enough when you look at the census and what might happen to our congressional seats. So I'd like to see us a little more densely populated, in all candor. You also suggested that if I understood you correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you also suggested that the policy consideration behind referendums in cities and towns was a substitute for the fact that we don't have a statewide, it's not required, not going to have a statewide referendum on it. And when you looked at other states as models, there were referendums and referenda. So I guess I would suggest to you that if that logic is correct, then that is really logic to have a statewide referenda, not to place the burden on the 39 and expense on the 39 cities and towns to do it, and at least on a kind of a preliminary thinking it through, it seems kind of contradictory to the Home Rule Charter provisions of the Rhode Island Constitution, in which we repose that kind of authority, that corporate authority, in the town and city councils. And if we've reposed corporate authority for the many other policy decisions they make, why do we accept, why do we say that the cities and towns council do not have the necessary judgment and sophistication to make that decision under their exercise of corporate authority pursuant to the Home Rule Charter provisions of the Rhode Island Constitution. So I'm not sure that logic commends putting that responsibility and that burden for all those referenda on all the cities and towns. The benefit and burdens analysis that Senator Palmer, I think, just summed up pretty well. I can't help but think that what that does is reinforce exactly what Senator Seveny was saying before, that while we all do it, right? We look at we pick and choose, we look at the best of what has worked in other states and what has not worked and avoid that. And so I think what Senator Seveny is suggesting, I'm not putting words in his mouth, but because, as noted, he's been an advocate for this, and he's convinced me that our current substance and prevention abuse strategy is pretty anemic. And I think a lot of what we've heard in your discussion confirms that, really. And so if we are going to, if we're going to do this, it probably represents a real opportunity to use the revenue in a more creative way than other states have done. And it's an opportunity for us to be a leader in determining that this is an opportunity to enhance substance abuse and prevention programs in the state. So I'd ask you to consider that as well. And I couldn't endorse more strongly or support more strongly what Senator Seveny has said on that subject in the course of this hearing, and particularly because I think it's been neglected in the discussion up to this point, and neglected really in the presentation that we've had. And I know we have Dr. Scott coming up in a moment. There's a lot of moving parts here. I'm not sure I understand all of them. I think 28 FTEs, though, is a lot of people to bring on board in the embryonic stages of the program. And I think we might want to look to find some efficiencies in how we do that. The legislation also calls for establishing the Medical Advisory Board to provide recommendations on the regulation of marijuana. I'm concerned that if the legislation identifies the need for a more robust and more in-depth regulatory regimen that we're putting the board on later or contemporaneous with the program, and that if there's a need for that, if I'm understanding what the Medical Advisory Board is going to do, and it may be a good idea for you to maybe provide a little bit of explanation on that, but it would seem that if you've identified that need, then let's have that robust, in-depth regulatory regimen in place before we start the program. And enough narration. Question: what happens, or let me say it another way, in doing your revenue calculations, does it make a difference to your calculations how many cities and towns approve?
There is a certain amount of capture that comes into our revenue estimates, and I'll let Matt speak to this. But if we are not able to make this accessible like we've seen with the medical program, a substantial amount of the medical program right now still exists in people's homes or in the illicit market because it's not accessible enough. There is some limited threshold that we would need to realize revenue and meet the needs of the market based off of how it's been established in looking at other states. We need at least to capture the minimum amount of market that Colorado and Washington has, which are the per capita use and spend per person data that we use to inform this. I'll let Matt see if he has anything to add.
And Matt, if I could just clarify my question, because I understand what you're saying about the amount of the market you need to capture and the per capita use. But I'm asking a different question. I don't know if it makes a difference or not. But how many cities and towns did you assume, if it was relevant to your revenue calculations, how many cities and towns did you assume would approve the program? And if you determined it wasn't relevant to your revenue calculations, just why not?
Thank you, Senator. So yes, we basically looked at current usage of marijuana in the state to figure out how many users we have currently based on those surveys that Norm mentioned earlier, and then looked at other states who have markets, mainly Colorado and Washington, to figure out what is their per user cultivation and per user retail sales in those other states. And we didn't really assume any number of towns who would or would not have retail or other license types. We basically assumed that the market will be fully satisfied by whatever licenses were created out there.
So, just postulating, if only 5 cities and towns approved this after we go through all this, and we've pushed the approval, if it goes to the referenda as it's now proposed, out to November 2020 under the recent amendment, right? So if only a handful or less of the city and towns approve this, where does that leave us?
I think it probably depends on which cities and towns approve or don't approve. I mean, if Providence does not approve, obviously that's probably going to impact your revenue assessment, right? So it probably depends on which towns choose to have this or to not have this.
Okay. No, thank you. Senator Sosnowski.
Let's see if I can. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just quickly, I have an agricultural question. So I think we can all agree that this product, that whether it's hemp or cannabis, is a agricultural product, correct? It's grown, it's an agricultural product. Yes or no?
Under the State Zoning Enabling Act, plant agriculture is the growth of plant for food or fiber. So for industrial hemp, absolutely, fiber it meets that threshold. When you're talking about medical marijuana as it exists right now under state law, it is not classified as it's not that same fiber, and it's not considered a food, not under the existing food code or the federal food code. So I just want to make sure that we talk about marijuana, medical marijuana or marijuana separately right now under existing state law from industrial hemp. Absolutely, industrial hemp under the Act and the definition of the State Zoning Enabling Act, yes, it's an agricultural use.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, if I may. In other states, let's just talk about neighboring Massachusetts. That's an easy one. It's close by. I know you've been doing extensive research, Colorado and so forth. Does the Department of Agriculture have anything to do with the cultivation of cannabis or helping the licensing? I don't know if it's Department of Business Regulation or whoever the licensing authority is in Massachusetts. Do they work at all? Because you had mentioned the use of fungicides and pesticides and so forth. And forgive me, I'm just curious because Division of Agriculture licenses, they license pesticide applicators. And I didn't realize, maybe you can clarify for me, if the Department of Business Regulation has that authority to regulate pesticide use. So you see where I'm coming from?
Absolutely.
So I'm concerned that the Division of Agriculture probably isn't involved enough in this, but you can go right ahead and.
The section of our current regulations that talk about pesticides was developed in conjunction with the Department of Environmental Management and their team that does the pesticide enforcement. Technically speaking, you could not use, under federal law, any pesticide on this because it's not an approved use on the label. You can only use a pesticide under the label. All pesticide labels are governed by the EPA. That's a federal agency which doesn't recognize this substance or growing of the crop, at least until this latest change under the Farm Act. So what we did was very similar to what other states did. We brought in the state experts, which were the Department of Environmental Management here, and we said, this is the stance that other states have taken. What are the products that could be approved in the method? And we put that in our regulations as a condition of the license. Okay. So we say, here's what the Department of Environmental Management says can be used. They have to be tolerance, 25, I believe it's F products, which are minimum risk tolerance products. You have to use them in coordination with the label when it refers to generic plants or bedding plants. If it's approved for outdoor use, you can't use it indoors because you don't get the photo degradation, things like that. So we work very, very closely with DEM, and when we're in a facility, and we see something, we have a question, we defer to DEM to make sure that those pesticides comply with the license rules and regulations, but also the existing state law that they have to make sure that all the people who apply pesticides are doing so under the proper registrations and licenses from them. We also have them as part of our licensing approval process for industrial hemp. They review the applications, and we're both kind of co-signatories to the industrial hemp licenses for handling and for growing. They are the named division within that statute, and we are the department, and we work together on this. And when it comes to manufacturing, we have them go through the Department of Environmental Management's process to make sure that anything that could impact groundwater or runoff or emissions satisfies their existing regulations and rules. So we work very closely with them for our existing industrial hemp program, and they would continue to be a part of this as they have been on medical marijuana.
And if I may, Mr. Chairman, thank you for that. And I thank you for the changes in the regulations. I am aware of that, and I thank you for that. But as we're moving forward, and the FTEs that are going to go to DBR, this, in my opinion, it is an agricultural product. I just think that I know you're talking about the letter of the law and so forth, but I just think Division of Agriculture, if we're going to continue to expand the growth of recreational marijuana, which this is I think Division of Agriculture, there should be more FTEs in Division of Agriculture to assist inspections, regulations, and so forth. And rather than being so heavily weighted with FTEs over at DBR. And this is just a critique because I really think that Division of Agriculture does have a strong role. I still hear complaints about individuals who are purchasing medical marijuana from certain facilities and having reactions either from the fertilizer that's being applied or the fungicide that's being applied or some type of growing media, if you will. I am not assured that the inspections are what they should be. And I think people with horticultural background and pesticide background we need more of them involved in this. But that's my 2 cents worth, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Any other, Senator Ashenbaugh?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You've all done a lot of work on this, and there's a lot of discussion left to be had tonight and a lot of witnesses, but I want to focus on one section that really, and the risk of sounding dogmatic here, really needs to be reworked, and I say it as a guy who deals with prosecution and criminal defense and has for his entire career and as a former law enforcement officer, and that has to do with Section 2128.10-12, unlawful distribution to minors and the penalties. And I'm stealing a little of the thunder of Steve Brown and the ACLU here, who so aptly pointed out some of the shortcomings in this section. And really what happens in this section is and I'm going to take a liberty, I'm not trying to speak for you, but I'm going to. In the quest to seek penalties to create a disincentive for the use by juveniles and to dissuade people, sort of to act as a deterrent for adults giving marijuana to juveniles, the pendulum on the penalty section has swung so far to the draconian side. It's a felony for someone to give it to somebody who's underage. That's wrong. That's misplaced. You won't find that anywhere else in the general laws. You won't find it. You won't. And if you're trying to tie it back into Schedule 1, it's misplaced because the drug's already been found to have medicinal value. You need to look at that. That needs to go. It should be more in concert with the criminal laws that exist for the use of alcohol and people that are violators of alcohol, as you did tying it under the penalties for driving while intoxicated with the 6-month loss. You're on the right track there. This section needs to be reworked. It's wrong. You should strike it all and put a section in there that makes it more proportionate to the penalties, more proportionate to the offense. And I'm just trying to keep it general. And I think some of the concerns that the ACLU pointed out in that respect should be looked at. They could help here. They could help with some of the language here. And the violation of $10,000 up to $10,000, that as well, it's misplaced. I understand what you're trying to do, and I applaud it. And quite frankly now, paradoxically, it's one of the reasons I didn't sign on to the bills, because I didn't find the juvenile penalties to be, strike that, the juvenile rehabilitative process and disincentives to be strong enough. If you're an adult and you want to use recreational marijuana and you're not harming anybody, God bless you, right? But if you're a juvenile, we have a paternalistic responsibility as a society to ensure that we're not promoting recreational use among juveniles, right? We'd all agree on that. And anybody who doesn't, I think there's something wrong with them, just as we would alcohol. And so in order to make that section of this proposed law consistent with our other laws dealing with alcohol and drugs that we don't consider to be, that true Schedule 1, heroin, fentanyl, things of that, the proportionate measure of the penalties needs to be consistent. Am I making sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and the other thing is, as Senator Conley talked about, Chairman Conley, monies that are properly appropriated to education and disincentives, we can't do enough of that. We really can't. It's a different day and age today, and it is what it is. I understand the drive to generate revenue, and I don't oppose that at all, frankly, but it's the regulatory scheme that includes education, continued education for our juvenile population and disincentives there. And it's not an easy fix. And I'm intentionally being general because there's, it's something you've worked hard at and it needs to be really fleshed out. But anyways, I'll leave this alone. But these penalties really need to be more consistent. I hope that falls on your ears positively.
Yes. Thank you, Senator.
Any other questions or comments? Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate your patience and the depth of your responses to committee members. Thank you for your time, and thank you for the hard work that you've done on this article in the budget.
Thank you, and Mr. Chairman, not to prolong this, but you asked about the advisory board, the legislative board. That's a structure that exists in the medical program that
Yeah.
we thought was appropriate to have constant communication and education and input from the legislature, so that's where that comes from. It's the same structure and language there. You also asked about FTEs. Right now, the Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commission has well over 60 FTEs, and I believe they're going to have over 85 or 90 by the end of this year, and could get you some information from other states in terms of what they budgeted and also what they have in place based on their population sizes.
I'm convinced we're smarter and more efficient than Massachusetts, and whatever they do, we will do it better.
Sounds good.
All right, thanks. So, thank you again.